It was just another ordinary day. At least, it started that way. I was walking down the street, minding my own business, trying to get to work. The morning rush had begun, people heading in all directions, the usual bustle of the city filling the air. But then I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A cop. A police officer in a uniform, standing by the sidewalk. I didn't think much of it at first, but then, out of nowhere, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I turned, surprised, and saw a man in uniform glaring at me. He was tall, a little intimidating, but his expression was what made my stomach churn. It was like he already knew who I was, and he didn't like it one bit. "You," he said, voice cold, "come with me." "Why? What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep calm, but confusion and fear crept into my voice. "Just do what I say," he ordered. His grip on my arm tightened, and I could see the look in his eyes. He thought he was in control. He thought I was just some guy he could push around. I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of a nightmare. The worst part, he didn't even give me a reason. He didn't explain anything, just dragged me down to the station without saying a word. The whole time I tried to stay calm, to reason with him. But the harder I tried, the more I could feel the tension building between us. Hours later, I found myself in a courtroom. A place I never thought I'd be. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sat in that cold chair, trying to make sense of everything. The cop had accused me of something I had never done. I could hardly believe it. The charges were vague, but it didn't matter. He had already painted me as guilty in front of everyone. The judge was there, the lawyers, everything felt surreal. I couldn't help but feel like I was trapped in a bad dream. As the proceedings started, I saw the cop, let's call him Officer Reynolds, sitting in the front, looking smug, like he already won. His eyes never left me. It was like he was enjoying every moment of this. But then something happened. A voice spoke up from the back of the room. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the defense lawyer's either. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," the voice said, calm and measured, "but I have something to add." I turned around, stunned to see a man in a suit walking toward the stand. His presence was commanding. I didn't recognize him, but there was something about him that made the entire room shift. "Who is that?" I whispered to my lawyer, confused. That's Mr. Franklin James, a federal prosecutor," my lawyer whispered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just some random guy. This was someone who worked on cases bigger than anything I could ever imagine. And here he was, standing up in defense of me. "I've reviewed the evidence, and I'm afraid Officer Reynolds is mistaken," Mr. James continued, his voice steady. "In fact, I'm the one who needs to be questioning him. This whole case is built on assumptions, not facts." My mind was racing. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why would a federal prosecutor be stepping in to help me? And why now? The courtroom fell silent, and all eyes turned to Mr. James as he made his way toward the stand. Officer Reynolds' face, once confident and self-assured, started to show signs of discomfort. He shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting this turn of events. I still couldn't process what was happening, but I could feel the tide beginning to shift in my favor. Mr. James took the floor, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Your Honor, I've reviewed the officer's entire report. The accusations made against this man," he pointed at me, "are completely unfounded. He has no criminal record, no history of violence. He is a respected member of this community." I could see Reynolds starting to squirm. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, but his voice was shaky now, the arrogance from earlier completely gone. "I'm sorry, officer, but I think you're the one who's mistaken," Mr. James said. "And I'm afraid that your actions today may have been driven by something personal." I felt a chill run down my spine. Personal? What did that even mean? Officer Reynolds was starting to get defensive, his jaw tightening. But Mr. James wasn't done. "You see, Reynolds," he said, "I know what this is about. I know why you're doing this." The courtroom held its breath, the tension thick in the air. Reynolds' face drained of color. His eyes darted around, but he couldn't hide the fear creeping in. "I'll make this simple," Mr. James continued. "You've targeted this man, not because he's a criminal, but because he's someone you thought you could easily intimidate. What you didn't know is that he's more than just a regular citizen. He's a federal prosecutor, just like me." There was a long pause, a A complete silence. I felt my heart racing. I had no idea how he knew this. How could Mr. James know that I was a prosecutor? I'd never mentioned it to anyone, but somehow he knew. Reynolds stood up, shaking now. "You're lying," he snapped, but his voice trembled. Mr. James turned to the judge. "If it pleases the court, I'd like to submit my credentials for review." It's clear that Officer Reynolds had no idea who he was dealing with. I could feel the weight of the moment. Reynolds, the one who had been so sure of himself, was now crumbling under the pressure. His whole world, built on this false accusation, was starting to fall apart. And as much as I wanted to feel triumphant, all I could think about was how this could have turned out so differently. The judge gave a slow nod, signaling for a brief recess. The room buzzed with whispers, my head was spinning, and it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. Mr. James motioned for me to come over, and I followed him to a quieter corner of the courtroom. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, like he was trying to reassure me. I could hardly speak. The whole situation was too overwhelming. "How did you know?" I finally managed to ask, still trying to process everything. Mr. James smiled, though it wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from someone in a victory. It was more of a knowing, almost sympathetic look. "I've been keeping tabs on this case for a while. When I saw your name on the list, I figured I might be able to help. But what really got me was seeing Reynolds' behavior. I could tell from the start that this wasn't about the facts." I felt a rush of gratitude toward him. He didn't have to do this, but he did. I was a stranger to him, yet he was willing to step in and help when I needed it most. Before I could say anything else, the judge returned, signaling for the courtroom to resume. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on us as we made our way back to our seats. The rest of the proceedings were swift. Officer Reynolds, his confidence shattered, was forced to admit that he had acted out of bias, personal bias, to be exact. It turns out, Reynolds had a history of making false accusations against black men in particular, and he had picked me as his latest target without a second thought. But the truth didn't stop there. Mr. James, with his sharp eye and quick thinking, had found even more troubling details in Reynolds' past, things that would destroy his career. There was no way Reynolds could escape the consequences of his actions now. As the judge ruled in my favor, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The case was dismissed, and Reynolds was ordered to answer for his misconduct. I thought about how close I came to losing everything, how easily this could have turned into another story of injustice. But, in the end, truth prevailed. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. I was free, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something bigger than myself. It wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about a system that had failed. And finally, a crack in that system had shown some light. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't shake the image of Officer Reynolds' face when the truth came out. It was almost surreal, watching someone who had once been so sure of themselves crumble in front of everyone. But there was no satisfaction in it. No joy. Instead, I felt something heavier, like a weight that would always linger in the back of my mind. The media got hold of the story, of course. It spread quickly, how a cop had tried to falsely accuse a man, only to discover that the very person he targeted was a federal prosecutor. It became one of those stories that people couldn't stop talking about. But for me, it wasn't about the attention. It wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about the truth, about the quiet, painful reminder that in this world, there are still people who think they can get away with injustice, just because they hold power. I took some time off work after everything settled down. I needed to process it all. The whole thing had shaken me to my core. I wasn't the same person I was before. I couldn't help but think about all the others who weren't so lucky, people who didn't have the means or the connections to fight back. Then came the letter. It arrived a week after the case was closed, tucked into an envelope, the handwriting on it unfamiliar. My heart skipped when I saw it. I opened it cautiously, almost afraid of what it might say. It was from Mr. James. "Dear Mr. Harper, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for your grace and your courage throughout this whole process. I know it wasn't easy, and I'm glad you didn't give up. But more importantly, I hope you realize that what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about your case. It was about everyone who feels voiceless in the face of injustice. We all have a role to play in making sure these things don't happen to others. Keep fighting the good fight. Sincerely, Franklin James. I sat there for a while, staring at the letter, overwhelmed. His words stuck with me. They weren't just comforting, they were a call to action. And in that moment I realized that my role wasn't finished. This experience had shown me that justice wasn't always automatic. It had to be fought for. Every single day. In the months that followed, my life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. But something had changed inside me. I was more aware now. More alert to the injustices that could happen in the blink of an eye. My work as a prosecutor became not just a job. It felt like a responsibility, a duty to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. I started working on cases that I might have passed over before, cases involving people who didn't have the resources or connections to fight the system. I knew what it felt like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else's decisions. And I wasn't going to let that happen again. Not to anyone else. I saw a different side of my job. I wasn't just representing the law. I was representing fairness, truth, and the people who needed someone to speak up for them. And I did it with a new sense of urgency. Every day. But there were still reminders of the past, little things that would pop up and bring everything rushing back. The way people looked at me when I walked into a room, like they were wondering what kind of man I really was. The occasional news story about another cop or official being caught in a scandal, another reminder that things were still broken, that things weren't always as they seemed. And then one day I was sitting in my office, reviewing a case file, when I got a call. I recognized the number instantly. It was Mr. James. "Hello, Franklin," I said with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Hey, it's good to hear your voice," he said. "I've been keeping an eye on you. You're doing some great work." I smiled. "I'm trying. But honestly, I think I've just learned to see things differently." He paused for a moment. "That's good. We all need to see things differently. The truth is, you've got a long road ahead of you, but if anyone can keep fighting for what's right, it's you." I didn't know what to say. It was humbling, hearing that from someone like him. Someone who had been through his own battles, someone who had helped me when I needed it most. "I'll keep fighting," I finally said. "For everyone who needs it." And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the right path. Not just for me, but for everyone else who had ever been wronged. I wasn't just some prosecutor anymore. I was a fighter for justice, and that, I realized, was exactly where I was meant to be. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support means a lot to us. Also, if this story resonated with you, please give it a like, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to share with your friends. Let's keep the conversation going. See you in the next video.